Thank you all very much. Hello, I'm Zak Ebrahim, and I'm here today to share some stories from my life in the hopes of illustrating that no matter what path you're put on, you can choose to promote peace. Excuse me. Before I begin, I feel the need to explain that my story is in no way a description of the vast majority of Muslim family life, both here in America and abroad. Excuse me. In fact, when people take the time to interact with one another, it doesn't take long to realize that for the most part, we all want the same things out of life. A job with a decent wage, a safe environment for our children, and to live in a community that doesn't chastise us for our beliefs. However, in every religion, in every population, you'll find a small group of people who hold so fervently to their beliefs that they feel they must use any means necessary to make others live as they do. Being raised in the home of a Muslim zealot, I've been exposed to many of the things Americans fear about Islam, yet I stand here promoting peace. This would be impossible in a world where we hang on to those old prejudices. I'm here to dispel some of the stereotypes that certain politicians and media pundits attempt to project into mainstream society. I feel that I can use these examples to combat those who would take advantage of Americans' fears for their own ends, because of political opportunists who use the more radical elements of Islam to generalize the beliefs of all Muslims, but also because of men like Faiz al-Shahzad, for instance, who believes that the answer to American foreign policy is trying to detonate a car bomb in Times Square. I feel I can speak up to balance the scales. Obviously, it's a foolish mistake to believe that religious extremism is exclusive to Islam. Unfortunately, there are endless examples in every belief system of religiously motivated violence. But as a society that values the individual freedoms afforded to us in our Constitution, it's un-American to ostracize entire communities for the actions of a few. When we ostracize the innocent, it tears apart the fabric of our society, which only works to foment the next generation of intolerance. Now, that being said, I would like to illustrate the path that I was put on as a child by my father, who for most of my life has resided in maximum security prisons. It was a special Friday for me. I was a normal 6-year-old staring at the chalkboard waiting for the 3 o'clock bell to ring so that I could escape from school. But that day my father was waiting in the hallway early. He said, "Salaam alaikum," which means peace be upon you, and I replied, "Wa alaikum salam," and peace be upon you, the proper way for two Muslims to greet one another. He tells me that we're going to the mosque for Friday prayer, where the blind Sheikh Omar Abdurrahman was to preach. You see, at midday every Friday, millions of Muslims around the world gather into mosques to listen to sermons given by sheikhs. The Quran, the sacred text of Islam, says that praying in a group brings you more blessings than praying alone, making Friday prayer the most blessed prayer of the week. Most clerics preach harmony between Muslims and non-Muslims, believing that there's a place in this world for all of its inhabitants to live in coexistence. The blind sheikh was not one of these men. He sat at the front of the worshippers with a microphone attached to his collar, and I tried my best to mimic my father as he listened intently to the sheikh's words. That day, the sheikh argued that Western culture was corrupting Muslims all over the planet, that the consequences of American democracy were materialism, sexual perversion, and idolatry, meant to distract believers from the true word of God, laying the blame for the Muslim world's ills on many of the same groups that Jerry Falwell blamed for 9/11, pagans, feminists, and gays. But the sheikh saved his most venomous words for that of the nation of Israel. He spoke of interference and collusion by the United States and its Western allies to further their agenda at the expense of Muslim nations. He also claimed that the United States had persevered in its Cold War with the Soviet Union by using the hearts and bodies of Muslims as a military and economic strain, and that once the Soviets fell, America discarded those Afghan fighters like trash on the side of the road. When he'd finished his sermon, my father took my hand and he led me toward the front. This wasn't the first time I'd met the sheikh. In fact, I had spent more than a few nights either at the mosque or at one of my father's friends' houses, or even in our own living room, sitting on the floor listening to the sheikh and the other men discuss religion and politics. I realized it was always somewhat ominous exchanging words with the sheikh after one of his speeches. And it's looking back now that I realize even in a room full of people vying for his attention, his mind was somewhere else, probably still wrapped with the passion and anger he clearly conveyed in his speech. On the drive home that afternoon, I wondered to myself what made the sheikh and his followers so intensely devout. I asked my father, when did you become such a good Muslim? And he replied, when I came to this country and saw everything that was wrong with it. And in that instant, I saw the same look on his face that I had seen earlier on the sheikh's. Our family dynamic began to change soon after. It was during that time, at the height of the Afghan war, that I was forced to say goodbye to one of my best friends. His stepfather took him and his siblings from their home in New Jersey to Pakistan to train and then eventually fight in Afghanistan. He was 10 at the time. Because of his inexperience, he was used to lob grenades at the enemy's occupying forces. And when he'd returned to America less than a year later, where once there stood a happy, vibrant child, now stood a solemn veteran of the Afghan war. He was a shadow of his former self, his innocence taken from him by a war he had no business being a part of. This is what happens when we use violence as a resolution of conflict. In a back-and-forth effort to gain even the slightest strategic advantage against one's enemies, man has gone to lengths that seem inconceivable to those who are sheltered from the negative effects of war. But make no mistake, humanity's shown that it's willing to exploit almost any resource, even the lives of children, all in the name of one ideology or another. That summer, after I turned, I guess I was about 7 at the time, my grandfather came to visit our family from Egypt. Little did he know, my father had brought him here to try and convince him to take my family back to Egypt so that he could go fight in the Afghan war. You see, at the time, the United States was secretly funding the mujahideen, the Muslim men and sometimes children who were going to Afghanistan from all over the world to fight. My grandfather's response was, absolutely not. Your family is your responsibility. If you want to make jihad, stay here and take care of them. Now let's take that word jihad, for example. If you were to ask the average person, what do you think jihad means? They might say that it's an act of terrorism, or that it means holy war. But that is not the definition of jihad. In reality, it has a much more abstract meaning. And in fact, in Islam, the Prophet Muhammad specifically refers to jihad that precludes violence as the greater jihad. And it was with that lesson that I was taught that jihad can simply mean striving to live a moral and virtuous life. My grandfather thought that he'd won the argument, but my father was left only frustrated and unwilling to find a non-violent outlet for those frustrations. On November 5th, 1990, when I was 7 years old, my father assassinated a man. That man was Rabbi Meir Kahane, the leader of the Jewish Defense League. The JDL, as it was called, was described by the federal government as the largest terrorist organization operating inside the United States at the time. While attempting to flee the scene, my father was also shot by a federal postal officer, and he and Meir Kahane were rushed to the hospital with similar gunshot wounds. Kahane died at Bellevue Hospital that night. My father lived. Although initially acquitted of the murder while serving time on assault and weapons charges, he began planning attacks on a dozen New York City landmarks, including tunnels, synagogues, and United Nations headquarters. Thankfully, those plans were foiled by an FBI informant. Sadly, the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center was not. My father, Al-Sayed Nosser, would eventually be convicted for his involvement in the plot. A few months prior to his arrest, he sat me down and explained that for the past few weekends, he and some friends had been going to a shooting range for target practice. And he explained that I'd be going with him the next morning, and to be honest, I was so excited I could barely sleep that night. And my excitement once again began to mount the next morning when we got into the car. We arrived at Calverton Shooting Range, which, unbeknownst to our group, was being surveilled by the FBI. And we walked towards a group of men huddled by the trunk of a car, and inside were a range of weapons. On my first turn to shoot, my father showed me how to hold the rifle to my shoulder and explained how to aim at the target about 30 yards off. I was so nervous my palms were sweating. And I pointed it at the target, I gently squeezed the trigger, and my ears rang and the noise echoed through the woods that surrounded the range, and a small notch showed where the bullet had broken through the canvas. Hearing the praise from the men around me, and with my father looking over my shoulder smiling, it was my proudest moment. He seemed to be having almost as much fun as I was, if not more. Using a fully automatic weapon, he shot the legs out from under one of the larger targets, causing it to come crashing to the ground. And the men all shouted and had a laugh. But by late morning, it began to drizzle, and I knew our time at the range was coming to an end. So on my last turn, I took aim at the target and let each bullet fly. The last one hit the small orange light that sat on top of the target, and to everyone's surprise, especially mine, the entire target burst into flames. And as I stood there watching the black smoke mix into the gray sky, my uncle turned to the other men and in Arabic said, "Ibn Abu," like father, like son. They all seemed to get a really big laugh out of that comment, but it wasn't until a few years later that I fully understood what they thought was so funny. They thought they saw in me the same destruction my father was capable of. Those men would eventually be convicted of placing a van filled with 1,500 pounds of explosives into the sub-level parking lot of the World Trade Center's North Tower, causing an explosion that killed 6 people and injured over 1,000 others. These were the men that I looked up to. These were the men that I called Ammu, which means uncle. It saddens me to think that had they not committed this crime, the innocent victims killed in the attack would be at home spending time with their loved ones. Instead, their families were forced to live their lives without their guidance and companionship. I was 7 years old when my father went to prison, and there's not a day that goes by that I don't wish he'd chosen a peaceful life with his family. Instead, he exposed me from a very young age to the intolerance and radical nature of extremism. And yet I stand before you all today with this simple message, that no matter the level of violence you've been exposed to, it doesn't have to define your character. That in all of us is the ability to change our paths. I spent years of my young life visiting him in different prisons, Rikers Island, the federal prison in Manhattan, and even entire family weekends inside Attica State Penitentiary. I can still remember my first trip to Rikers like it was yesterday. It was a dull gray morning. We'd gotten into our old wood-paneled station wagon, and it was pretty early. We had to make the trip into New York City. I remember my nervousness as we entered the Rikers Island parking lot. A light mist seemed to cut us off from the rest of the world. The tall gray walls and barbed wire fences only added to the atmosphere. Although, because my father had been in the hospital recuperating from his wounds, it had been several weeks since I'd last seen him, and it was pretty obvious even to a 7-year-old that this was going to be a strange day. A bus took us across a bridge to the main facility where we were taken into a building and frisked for any prohibited items. And then we were walked on a long hallway lined with cells that provided privacy for the families visiting inmates. And as the guard opened the door, I saw my father sitting in a plastic chair wearing an orange jumpsuit. And he stood up and he smiled and he took his time giving me a hug. And then we sat down across from each other at the table. The first thing I noticed was the long surgical scar that ran across his chest and up his neck, where the doctors had tried to remove the bullet that was lodged inside him. I remember the whole time trying not to stare at it. And as he and my mother, or as I sat at the table wondering how his being in prison would affect our family life, the two of them sat in conversation. That first trip to Rikers was nerve-wracking, but as the weeks turned into months, it all became routine to have to pass through armed guards and barbed fences in order to see my father. This went on for years, but eventually my mother remarried, and we decided as a family to discontinue any further contact with him. We also changed our names so as to hide our identity from the community in which we lived. It's certainly unusual when an American citizen admits to being the son of the first member of a bin Laden organization to shed blood on American soil. Shame for what my father had done and fear for how I would be judged for his actions had caused me to hide my identity from most of those who knew me. I realized at a young age I had to be careful who I told my life story to. People's reactions have ranged from nervous laughter and shock to outright anger and threats against my life. I even once sustained a defensive wound as I tried grabbing a knife from the hand of someone I thought was a friend as he lunged at me exclaiming, "I'd be doing this country a service if I killed you." Thankfully, I was able to escape without any serious injury. By the time I turned 19, I had already moved 20 times in my life. That instability during my childhood didn't really provide an opportunity to make many friends. Each time I'd meet one or two people I began to feel comfortable around, it was time to pack up and move to the next town. And being the perpetual new kid at school, I was frequently the target of bullies. So for the most part, I spent my time at home reading books and watching TV or playing video games. For those reasons, my social skills were lacking, to say the least. And growing up in a bigoted household, I wasn't prepared for the real world. I've been raised to judge people based on arbitrary measurements, like a person's race or religion. One of the major turning points in my life came when I found a summer job at Busch Gardens, an amusement park in Florida. The exposure to so many different faiths and cultures was fundamental to the development of my character. I was able to contrast the stereotypes I'd been taught as a child with real-life experience and interaction, and it didn't take long for me to realize the disservice I was doing to myself and to those I was compelled to judge. Recognizing my own moral failings and being exposed to the outside world, I realized how little a person's race or sexual orientation or religion had to do with the formation of one's character. I had a conversation not long after that with my mother about how my worldview was starting to change, and she said something to me that I'll hold dear to my heart for as long as I live. She looked at me with the weary eyes of someone who'd experienced enough dogmatism to last a lifetime and said, "I'm tired of hating people." And it sounds so simple, but it was so profound for me that I often fight back tears just thinking about it. And it serves to me as a perfect reminder that, again, as Americans, it's our duty to protect the individual freedoms afforded to us. And as a society, we have to work together in order to achieve those goals. Remember that extremism thrives on the fringes of society. When we divide people into smaller and smaller groups based on one arbitrary distinction or another, we create communities ingrained with hostility toward one another. Until recently, I chose not to come out with my story because I was ashamed for what my father had done. But today, most times you hear about Islam or the Middle East in the news, it's usually related to some form of extremist behavior. And I knew that I could use these examples to combat those negative stereotypes. If I could show people that, although I'd been subjected to this violent, intolerant ideology as a child, that I didn't become fanaticized. That if I could choose to promote peace, then anyone can. As I mature, I realize the only way I can overcome the challenges of my past, which at times has been crippling, is to help others understand that hatred only produces more hate. But belief in nonviolence at least provides an opportunity to heal. Those cycles of violence, no matter how old, don't have to continue forever. I am not my father. And with that simple fact, I stand here as proof that violence isn't inherent in one's religion or race, nor is it mandated that the son must follow the ways of his father. And should we fulfill our obligation to live peacefully and to put in the work needed in order to obtain peace, however difficult it can sometimes be, that ultimately will leave this earth a better place for the ones we love. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.